Okay, let's get started. It's time to get started. All right, great. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from whichever part of the world you're joining us from. I hope we're all staying healthy and safe during this time. My name is Praveen, and I lead marketing at BrowserStack, and I'm really excited to sort of welcome all of you to episode 4 of Summer of Learning. Summer of Learning is a series that we started in May, to sort of help QA engineers, developers around the world, understand the basics of testing, and sort of skill themselves up through this time, right? And get to a level of expertise where they can integrate also with BrowserStack and also scale their test suites. So I'm really excited to see all of you here today, and thank you for attending. So let me start first with a few housekeeping pointers. We will be recording this webinar and sharing this recording with all of you post the session. We're also going to be taking up questions at the end of the webinar. So we'll save about 15 to 20 minutes to address any questions that you might have. What we ask you to do is use the Q&A button in the Zoom interface to put up your questions throughout the webinar. And Dave and I will basically sort of collate those questions and then answer them to as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. Great. So with that out of the way, let me spend just a couple of minutes introducing you to BrowserStack. So first, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our history. So BrowserStack was started 9 years ago by our co-founders, Ritesh and Nakul. And they started with a very basic problem that they wanted to solve, right? They launched BrowserStack out of a coffee shop because they could not test their websites on Internet Explorer, right? They were both using Macs to build their website and code on, and they did not have access to IE. And that sort of led to the birth of BrowserStack. And within 6 months, they had 1,000 customers. And today, 9 years later, we have 25,000 plus customers. We have 3 offices and 400 plus employees. Our 25,000 customers are across a variety of verticals. We've got all the famous sort of brands and logos across these verticals, including customers like Microsoft, Amazon, Spotify in the tech sector. We have some of the sort of the most sophisticated banks like Barclays, retail companies like Tesco and the Home Depot, who use BrowserStack to test their web apps and mobile apps. BrowserStack also powers the internet. So we power over 1,800 open source projects with testing. So we help these projects test their software. And projects like jQuery, Angular, Ember, Meteor, all use BrowserStack to test their open source projects. And we continue to support and sponsor open source projects every month. We also power the world's largest cloud providers. So companies like Amazon, Google, Oracle, and Microsoft use BrowserStack to test their platform. I want to talk to you a little bit about our scale. We have 2 million plus registered users on our platform who run 72 billion Selenium commands every year across 135 countries. And we have 15 globally distributed data centers, right, with our both for desktop and mobile. And so these sort of customers can access our platform with minimal latency by accessing data centers closest to them. Let me talk to you a little bit about our products. So we have 4 key products on our platform. The first 2 are around browser testing. So what we're going to talk about today is Automate, which is our automated testing product, which allows you to run your Selenium and JavaScript tests on real browsers and mobile devices. Live is our manual testing product. So with Live, you can actually boot up your website on a browser or a device, run your manual tests, go through your interactive testing, making sure that you're checking for any bugs before you release your websites to production. You can use integrations with tools like Jira and Trello to file bugs automatically from BrowserStack using Live. App Automate is our automated testing product for mobile apps. So with App Automate, we provide a grid of real mobile devices, which allow you to run your automated mobile app tests, right? Again, on real iOS and Android devices. You can use all the popular frameworks that exist. So you have Appium, you have Espresso, you have XUI Test, and Earl Grey. And lastly, we have App Live, which allows you to run your interactive, test your mobile apps interactively on, again, real iOS and Android devices. So these are our 4 key products. With that, I wanted to sort of introduce David Burns, who's going to be covering the webinar today and talking to you about Selenium testing at scale on the BrowserStack platform. So David, also known as the automated tester, he heads the open source team at BrowserStack. Through the open source team, we are trying to, as a company, give back to the open source community by contributing to some of the key open source projects around the testing ecosystem. David is also a core contributor to the Selenium project, co-editor of the WebDriver specification, and also is a chair of the browser testing and tools W3C working group. With that, I will hand it over to David. Over to you, David. David, I think you're on mute.
Okay, hopefully that has gone. That working?
Yep.
Right, cool. There we go. So thank you for the introduction, Praveen. So yeah, I am David Burns. I work on open source projects for BrowserStack, and one of the core things that I work on is Selenium. And so today I'm going to be walking you through kind of how to get your tests running in parallel. We'll kind of talk through some automation best practices, things that I think you should be concentrating on if your tests are running serially or in parallel. And if you kind of focus on doing these best practices along the way, running your tests in parallel should just happen, and you should just be able to do it. So we'll go from best practices to running some tests in parallel so that you can see how this works and why these things are important. We'll talk about infrastructure. And so this will be cases of like, what is your test infrastructure? So things that are running your tests look like, and as well as we'll also mention the infrastructure that you might also need for kind of testing your web application going forward. Also talk about some ideas around multiple browsers, because it is important that the web is not just a monoculture of kind of one browser only. And then we'll do a bit of build monitoring and then finish off with Q&A with the last 15 minutes, as Praveen mentioned earlier. So let's get started. Mark Zuckerberg famously said that like Facebook want to move fast and break things, that they want to be able to do what they need to do it fast. And if things break, it's fine, right? Because they're as long as they're doing impactful work along the way, it's fine. But they started to realize that over time, this wasn't the case. They would be breaking a lot of things, and it would actually slow them down by not having proper testing, proper processes in place, and things like that. And so kind of moving fast is not just the kind of the most important things. It's kind of moving fast and not breaking things. Having the ability to kind of make sure that you're producing high quality code at the fastest that you can, and be able to kind of release when you want. We see this in things like CI/CD pipelines along the way. And so we must work whenever we're kind of creating tests or creating software to move fast and not break things along the way. But honestly, how many of us can say that we're going as fast as we can, or going fast at all? We've all been in a situation where we've kind of stood up some tests, started running them, and it would be hours or days for kind of certain groups of tests to finish. I know when I started, there would I tended to kick off some of our UI testing infrastructure, go home and then check the results in the morning and hope that there wasn't a bug in my automation code, never mind a bug in anywhere else. And so it's important to kind of honestly answer this. Do you think you're going as fast as you can? Because UI testing is truly the bottleneck when it comes to going fast. Starting up a browser, doing some actions that are likely going to require a full stack to be able to work is going to limit the speed that you can run your tests at. So with that in mind, let's move on to kind of talking about some of the best practices that we can do along the way whenever we're kind of creating and running our tests. These three steps are kind of the key for any automated test. So this could be your small unit test to a large test like a Selenium test. Whenever you kind of do these steps, it's always important to kind of have them there, and then everything else should hopefully just work. So start from a known place. A lot of when you're testing a website, you'll kind of load the home page, for example, and you'll know where you are and how you're doing it. You should do as small a task as you can. And so I'm not saying that you should do one thing, but make the test do as little as possible. So kind of it does this one thing. So if it needs to go to a page and do one action, like one process, and then then do all its assertions, it should do that. It shouldn't kind of walk across the whole website. And so it should be as small as you can make it. And when all the assertions have happened, you should have your tests return back to its original state. So if you kind of needed to log in your first part, which is start from a known place, if you needed to log in as part of your steps, make sure that you've logged out, because little things like this can transfer state between tests. And as I kind of go through some of the things later, when we're talking about some of the trade-offs that we're going to have to do about when talking about parallelism, knowing where these things lie can make your test run smoother and better over the time period. So whenever your tests are finished doing all their assertions, return back to a known place. And the main reason that we do this is autonomy. Each of the tests should just work on their own. If you were to kind of run a test and kind of on its own, it should work. If you were to run tests in any order, they should work. And that's because we've kind of got this main idea along the way of kind of starting from where we want to be, doing something incredibly small that we can get away with, and then returning back to that original place. That autonomy kind of simplifies work and simplifies code along the way. And so that if you've got one thing that's failing, you'll be able to debug it and look into it properly without having to kind of figure out which test has kind of left potential state around. And that's the key, is that we don't want our tests to have to rely on certain states, or if it does, it needs to be put into every test along the way. So I'm going to do a quick demo of an example. here I have some tests, and I will just make that smaller. And we've got a URL that our tests are going to work against. So this is just a little website that I kind of do little demos against. So I'll give you an example of what it looks like. When we go to it, it's going to ask some questions. We'll be able to vote like this. So is browser testing hard? Not so much, or sometimes it's hard as like flying up into the sky. And so, let's try that again. And then when we voted, it's going to do a quick tally of the votes. And I'd be able to vote again. I've got another question that we could play with in this case just test data, so nonsense answers. And so here we have some Selenium tests. Just for those who are watching along, like there is no expectation that you'll kind of need to be able to write all this up. I'm going to explain which each of the tests are doing, but these are available up on the BrowserStack GitHub organization. If you just look for Summer of Learning, you'll be able to see the code and have a play with it yourselves after the talk. So in this case, we've got a test where we're going to log on. So driver is, because I'm using PyTest. PyTest is my kind of favorite. I do a lot of things with Python, and PyTest is my favorite test runner. And you can inject different configurations into your tests. So if I look here, here's where kind of it creates a driver, navigate to the page for me, and then when I'm finished, the driver will be yielded back and it'll quit. So it just cleans everything up nice and neatly for me. And so in this case, we're going to find the username and type it in, the password, type logon. We're going to vote on the first question, vote on the second question. We're going to wait, just make sure that we do some waits, and then we'll just assert that some text is there. And so if I do this, PyTest, serial, helps if I type properly, site tests, and I run this, hopefully we're going to see 3 passing tests. We'll get browser, it's going to be as quick as possible, and hooray, we've got 3 tests working really well, and it does like exactly what it should do, and there's an assertion at the end. So great, we've got a perfect test. And so now I'm going to try see if I've applied the same logic that I've kind of been telling to everyone, that your test should start from somewhere, do something small, and return back to it. And the easiest way to make sure that I've done the right thing is to make sure that I can run my tests in parallel. So because I'm using PyTest, I'm going to be using its xdist plugin, but there are other test runners for different languages that can do things in parallel. So if you're in Java, you can use testng or JUnit. They can both run things in parallel. NUnit can do it as well if you're in .NET. And so there's Ruby variations too. So a lot of test runners nowadays try to do this because people want to run their tests incredibly fast and try use as much of their infrastructure. Like your laptop, it's a multi-core system, so if it has multiple cores, it can run things in parallel quite effectively. So in this case, I'm going to run the same test, n in this case, hopefully this is coming up nice and clearly for people. I'll just move this. Oh. And so I'm at the bottom here, and n is the number of tests that we want to run in parallel. And so we want serial again, site tests. And then as you can see, I've made no changes. I'm running the exact same test file that was passing before. And we're going to just check that, see if I've applied the same logic that I've kind of been passing on, and hopefully tests should work, shouldn't they? So we've got one test that's passed, and we've got two are just waiting. Oh dear. So we've had a timeout. And it would look like, it looks like it's tried to kind of do some of the things and it's noticed that when I've tried to log in or tried to vote using these examples, it's noticed that I wasn't logged in, and so my system has kicked me out. So a lot like what you saw earlier when I tried to vote, the page loaded, and then the system said that I wasn't logged in. So let's have a look at how we can improve it. So here we have a test that logs in, but in our other tests, we don't actually check that we've logged in. And if we go to configuration, we can also see that there is no mention of logging in. So perhaps we need to figure out a mechanism to log in and do that properly. So to save time and not to kind of try to do live coding, because every time I try to do live coding, it goes horribly wrong. I've copied over the same test into a different file. But I've made one change, which is we're going to kind of make sure that we can log in potentially into to our tests. And so here, we're going to try make sure that if the login page is found, that we log in, and if the page isn't, because for other reasons, because there might be times where we want tests not to start a new browser, not every test to start a new browser, and I'll get to that in a minute. We might just kind of not throw an error, and so we just want to log in, and then we've got our driver fixture as before. So creating the browser, creating everything, and then logging in, and we should be good to go. So the key difference here is that when I've been looking at it, the thing that kind of I need to make sure happens at the beginning of every test and kind of gets us back to that original test, original place, is the login. And so if I were to run this exact same test, except now we're going to wrong way around, serial to parallel, we should see the same tests parsing. And so if we go back to kind of the tests, the difference now is that we're focusing on making sure that those original kind of the key points that we would need to do at the beginning or later on are there. And so, and this is the crux of the login. It's just making sure that we've abstracted away a login, and so that if any changes happen, you could just do it there. And so those who might be applying like page object model design patterns or kind of screenplay design patterns, it simplifies a lot of the way that their tests work and the way that they could fix it, because you only need to go to the configuration, make sure it's correct there, and go on. Oh, sorry, it was that one. And so if you don't want to work with, like if you're working on different infrastructure and you want to test on different browsers, so this is an incredibly simplistic mechanism that I've set up here where it's only testing one browser. You could have reflection to kind of check which browser and start up each and every browser for you. And so this is why kind of it's important to kind of focus on doing each of these things in parallel. And so I've also created a copy in parallel, and so this is the same tests, except now that I've expanded each of the tests. I've put a sleep so that I can kind of show you some of it, but now we're going to try run, instead of 3 tests that we were doing before, we should be able to bump that up to 5, so that we can try get as many, like use the hardware that we have to kind of do each of the different things. So let's see how that gets on. Demigods have gone against me. Okay. I've clearly made 1 or 2 changes that I've not realized in there. But in theory, we could just, it's the same as kind of making sure that these tests are working, and we can expand on each of the different points. But I will now get back to my slides. Okay. So one of the things that we've kind of seen is that, like, when we start running these tests in parallel, we can start expanding how we're going to test things, and we get to a point where we might have, say, 100 different tests that we need to test in, and just kind of concentrating on your the 4. If we were to just only do the major browser version browsers, we would have 4 different browsers that we would need to test, and so that's 400 tests. If we start adding in mobile devices and potentially different size mobile devices, this grows quite a lot. And so kind of we need to think about the infrastructure that we start using. So BrowserStack simplifies that for us a little, in that, like, we don't need to care about it. But if you want to create your own, like, Selenium Cloud or Selenium Grid, you could go ahead and do that and kind of make sure everything is there. And that's just for where your tests are running. The other part that kind of we also need to think about along the way is making sure that our tests can truly run in parallel. And so this could be a case of like, does your, like the machine that your tests are running on, so this is not like where your browsers and your tests are running on, does that have enough hardware, or kind of like is the hardware up to date, or kind of can handle it to run tests as at the scale that you're hoping to do, so that you can kind of truly get the benefits of it. Because there are times where this might not actually be the case. I've seen cases where people are trying to run tests in parallel, but are using a Raspberry Pi as their CI infrastructure, and so in those cases, you're not going to get the kind of the scale that you're hoping for, and not getting the speed. And since a lot of what we've been talking about today is trying to increase your speed and trying to use your tests at scale, that's how you get your speed. But then you also need to think about your test server, and what is that working against. So if you've picked something like a Raspberry Pi to have your test server, and you suddenly have, say, 400 different tests, not exactly at the same time, working against your server, can it handle the load? Can it handle the data coming into it and the data going out of it? Like, is there enough infrastructure around your tests that this can be the case? Hopefully, yes, and that you've not kind of cut corners in setting up your test servers. But if you have, then kind of whenever you go into kind of writing your parallel tests, we need to kind of think about how much throughput we're going to put. The last thing you want to do is inadvertently DDoS your test servers or your local machine when testing things. And so it's important to kind of make sure that your tests can work and do this. But it's also important to kind of make sure that your test server can handle it and kind of won't suddenly die along the way. And so kind of we've talked about like running tests in parallel. We've run tests against our server, and we kind of do those. So we need to kind of think about these best practices. I'm reiterating them mostly because if you don't get this wrong and don't get this right, when I kind of get onto the next part, which you're really going to struggle, because like we've been running those tests in parallel, but we've only been running them essentially against one browser. And so it's important to kind of remember them. So whenever we start a test, we need to make sure we start from a known place. We do something small, and then we return to that known place. And the reason is that if we kind of look at running tests in parallel against multiple browsers, when multiple browsers kind of run at different speeds because they have different engines. So like if you compare like Chrome to Firefox or Chrome to IE, or kind of against Safari, like each of them is unique, and each of them has their own, as long as they try their best to follow standards, but they do have their own unique take on certain parts of standards if they've not been written properly. And so we need to kind of make sure that when we're testing, that we kind of test for fragmentation, that we kind of get all these different browsers on different infrastructure. And then when we kind of start talking about things like mobile, the increase there is amazing because each mobile device has like different screen resolutions, different size windows, and so that if you're kind of building your website to kind of work against these things, it can be quite chaotic to test against it and can be quite hard. And this is where kind of making sure that you've got this infrastructure that can kind of grow to what you need and be able to write your tests so that like your tests never bleed any state between each other is really, really, really important. And it's so important that kind of when we're talking about this and kind of getting to the test fragmentation part, like if you've got the first part down, which is the kind of test, start from somewhere known, do something small and return back to it. When you get to this stage of fragmentation, it should be easy to add on new infrastructure because your tests should just be able to handle it. And if not, you're actually focusing on important things that need to be fixed along the way. So with that in mind, I'm going to do one more demo. And if we go back here, one of the things that, because I've been talking about running things in parallel, is running tests as we need to. So in this case, I'm going to be, because what I'm going to be testing, it needs a lot. So I'm going to be using BrowserStack. I've created a remote version of this. So for those people who use WebDriver, a remote test will kind of, remote WebDriver is the ability to kind of use a Selenium grid. So that way we can call out, we can run everything. The BS local URL is a loopback. So I'm using the local tool from BrowserStack so that I create a tunnel between my machine here and BrowserStack, and we're going to run tests. And when I run it, because I've got configurations that I can use, I've set up that I can pass in what type of driver I want to be using. So in this case, it could be Firefox, it could be Safari. Here are known ones that I can test with and they should work. In this case, I want to also make sure that my tests work on different operating systems, and different operating systems also have different versions. And so I can just pass that in. And when I get down to running my tests, it's going to pass in the correct capabilities, and these capabilities tell BrowserStack, and if you don't use BrowserStack Selenium Grid, what you want to test against. So it could be the browser, the operating system, things like that. And there's just a few like different areas that it's just going to kind of just make sure is up to date, and so that I could run these. So here's just a bash file that's calling the tests, so that I can try run them all in parallel. And so that like if you were running this on, say you wanted to test all of these things, instead of running a bash file like I am, the ideal situation would be that you would use something like Jenkins or other like CI infrastructure and have a specific job for each browser or kind of each browser driver combination. However, like there is no hard and fast rule to how you pick this, but it's just about making sure that you kind of pick the right things. And so I'm just going to start these off. So if we do, and I'll run it. This should hopefully start up a whole bunch of tests. And if I go to my BrowserStack account, there we are. So here's my tests running. And I can kind of run a whole bunch of tests in parallel. I can get all the, I can see what's been run, how fast everything's running. At the top here, as I said, I'm going for 100 different combinations that I could think of, just for testing one, like my little website that was voting. I wanted to make sure that like different OSs and different browser versions could handle it. And so I'll just leave that running for a second. And as you can see, like the sessions are now starting to complete. Along the way, I've tested on an iPhone 10s. I've tested on Safari. Tested, saw it down here a bit earlier. Tested on Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and all on different operating systems as well. So Windows 10, Windows 8, OS X High Sierra, Capitan, Catalina, and kind of my tests that like the 100 different sessions. If I were to do this manually, it would have taken me a very long time to make sure it works across board. But here I've done everything in 1 minute 20. I know from experience that because I'm testing this against a local machine, I have been known to kind of kill my web server. So there's an example, but of why you kind of need to make sure that when you're testing these things, it can happen. And if we go back here, we've noticed that some of the tests have failed. But this is an example of kind of where you need to focus on making sure your web server can handle it. And why I wanted to kind of also show that kind of you need to be aware of it so that you're not just trying to run everything against your local machine constantly and hoping that it will just work. Cool. One of the things that also is important to do when going through all of this is that if you do notice when things go horribly wrong like that, that you have the ability to kind of kill that test suite. So like if you're kind of running hundreds of tests, and I've only got a very small example, but if you are like your test suite has like hundreds of tests and suddenly you're building up to kind of run everything in parallel like I've done there, you could be running a lot of tests and using a lot of infrastructure unnecessarily. So it's important to kind of make sure that there is some form of build monitoring. So if there are a lot of tests, that it kind of kills the build quickly and notifies people, or kind of you could be watching BrowserStack, the BrowserStack website, like I was, and if there's a lot of failures that you're, like if you notice, you can just go into BrowserStack and just cancel it. So it's important that you kind of, as part of these best practices and as you scale, that you kind of be aware of how your build is at all times and not just hope that your colleagues are solving the problems for you. And that's it really. So today, what we've covered is best practices. So start from a known place, do something small, as small as possible, and return to a known state. This means that you can kind of build out autonomy in your test suite. And this should be done ideally from when you create your test suite from the start, and should be done in the middle of your build of your project and done at the end. Like it's important, it's a constant task that I think people should be doing. And if you've got the right things in place, hopefully it actually adds no work to your team, because everyone who writes the test will be doing it properly, and so it's just done. Use proper weights where possible. So kind of don't put thread.sleep because you're trying to add a state that's not necessarily there. So use proper weights along the way so that you can find things. With your infrastructure, do you have enough capacity to do this? So this is not just your test grid, but I see your staging sites. Can you handle the extra load along the way and do it properly? Can you also support multiple browsers? And multiple browsers is something that's important because depending on where you are in the world, like there are different browsers are used extensively. So like parts of Germany, people use Firefox a lot more than people say in the UK who tend to use Chrome a lot more. And the data changes all the time, but that's an example, and kind of being able to test on multiple devices if you want to do mobile support. So kind of making sure that you can support the areas that you're in. And then we finished off with kind of just making sure that you've got the relevant build monitoring in place. And that could just be someone who once a week, like each team member once a week, just kind of reviews the builds and make sure that like if there are failures that they get cancelled or fixed in an appropriate time frame, rather than kind of just hoping that someone else will fix your problems for you. And with that, I am done. Hopefully there's some questions.
Great, thanks, David. All right, great. Let's try to take a crack at some of the questions. We've got about 12 minutes left. Okay, so the first question is, I think in the example that you ran in the beginning where you were showing the different polls, all your tests voted on the same poll, and if they were all running in parallel, right? And then so if you're running all of your tests in parallel and you're sort of voting on the same poll, the numbers would change, right, of the poll results.
Yeah.
So if you were doing an assertion on the number of votes, and they would fail, right, with your parallel tests, how would you solve something like that?
So in this case, like I think it's like if I was to test this properly, I'd probably just make sure that the number increased. If you wanted to make sure that the number increased exactly, like by 1, so you would need to make sure that you have like multiple web servers potentially set up running in parallel for this. And it would be like, what was the number when you started? Ideally, like if you've not seeded a database, it would be 0, and then you would just check that it's always 1. I think you also need to apply kind of a bit of a risk assessment. Like if you know that if you've tested it by hand and it only ever increases by 1 by hand, and then you create an automated test, is there value in checking that exact number, or is it more important to check that the number has increased? And so it tends to, I would always err on kind of when you're doing automated tests, that kind of making sure the number is increased. And then you could have like one serial test or one kind of smoke test before you go into kind of a heavy parallel test that kind of checks these like mission critical type things. And those can run in serial if needed. But I would try to limit those types of tests quite heavily.
All right, great. Thanks for that, David. I think the next question is around BrowserStack capabilities. How would I set that to WebDriver Manager?
So I'm WebDriver Manager is I think as a tool, I don't have a lot of experience about it, and it kind of tries to set up all the things locally for people. And so I think you would just need to, you don't need to kind of use WebDriver Manager to do things. You would just kind of use the remote WebDriver and remote WebDriver takes a URL that you pass in. So if I go to my examples, it's you would pass in a URL kind of like that, and you've got to put in your username and password, but then a URL like that, and then it would start speaking to that, and so that would be a remote WebDriver rather than kind of like Firefox driver, for example, which would be set up with like WebDriver Manager. But I don't have enough experience in that with that tool.
Okay, got it. The next question is around BDD. So can we run BDD tests with tools like JBehave, frameworks like JBehave? Can you run those in parallel?
In theory, yes. So like I'm not a big fan of BDD, to be honest. But yes, they should be able to, as long, like a lot of the limitations around things in parallel tend to be, can that runner do it? And most modern runners should be able to do things like that because people want to be able to get their results super fast. And so I would hope things, I'm pretty sure like Cucumber can do things in parallel. But I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure like Cucumber can do, so hopefully something like JBehave would be able to do it too.
Great. Okay, I think the next question is around the examples that you were running. So the file system structure and examples lead this user to consider that maybe it's a best practice to distinguish groups of serial tests from parallel tests. Is that the correct assumption to make here?
No, this is mostly so that I don't have to kind of rewrite things and not be. I've had a lot of, like with anyone who does talks, they've had a lot of bad luck when it comes to doing demos. It was mostly so I could kind of move to different directories and be able to see it myself. It also allows people, because the code is going up on GitHub, to be able to know which directory to go look in and be able to play with everything. That's just my personal thing. I think ideally when you write your tests, you should be designing them to be run in parallel, even though you might never do that, because the example, like from my example where I did in things with serial, say my tests were failing, this test that I've highlighted here is failing. The way these tests are designed, I would have to run the login test. Maybe this test, the first question test would be run first, I don't know. And then the second test question test would be run. And so if you consider the same practices that you're running for running parallel, also means that your tests are incredibly easy to debug because you can just run one test rather than kind of try work out the right order for your tests to get to. So that the directory structure has nothing to do with it.
Okay. Great. Okay, I think the next question is around driver instantiation and quitting when running in parallel, both for web browse, desktop web and mobile web.
Yep.
What is your recommendation as a best practice in terms of creating a driver before each test, or should I reuse it? And how should I deal with things like cleaning of cache and cookies and all of that stuff? So
there is no best practice around this. I know a lot of people hope that there is. Every test suite or every project that you work in will have a different answer for this. So like if you've got something that is incredibly UI heavy and you need to kind of test a lot of tests, you would be you don't want any potential states, you could start everything, every test with its own browser, but doing that is a lot of work for the machine doing it, because browsers are essentially operating systems nowadays. And so kind of every time the browser starts up, even though like Firefox and Chrome do their best to kind of make sure that they're super fast, it's still going to take like a second to start up. And so if you've got 1,000 tests, that's potentially like 1,000 seconds that you've been waiting just on startup. If you're using something like BrowserStack, you're also limited to like how many tests that you can queue at each time. And so you kind of need to balance how many tests you want to do against your queues and your infrastructure. And so it's about kind of making sure you can clean up along the way. And so that's why heading back to your known states. So if you have to log in with each test, but you can only like you want to run multiple files in parallel rather than every test, you could make sure that each test logs out, and potentially like that. In doing that, you'll be clearing your cache, certain caches anyway, because hopefully you'd be doing that for authentication reasons. And if there's other bits, you could try clear, like delete cookies. WebDriver has those abilities, and hopefully in the future there'll be more access to other parts of the browser where that hold state that you'd be able to delete that, and so it's this really fine balance that I think everyone always struggles with, to know like browser startup versus kind of making sure everything's clean. And so if you kind of have your test designed properly, which is kind of start from somewhere, do something small and return back to it, then hopefully you shouldn't have too many things bleeding through.
Okay, great. I think we have one more question, David. So I think this is around using test data. So in your example, how would I feed in like different username or different logins basically into my tests? And generally, what are some recommendations when it comes to, sort of storing and sort of running or passing through test data for all of my tests?
If you want to test multiple accounts, I think you need to have a way that's not hard-coded. So obviously you want to be kind of using something that can access this data. So you can have you want to try run your tests, like, so if it's storing data, or you're trying to read data for your tests, but like if you're hitting a website and storing it and you want to run things in parallel, where possible, try not to use proper databases or things like that. Try to do as much of it in memory as possible. That will allow things to be super fast, and because your tests are kind of testing the main logic, and like that last part of the database is very rare that someone's going to get that wrong, and you can kind of potentially test that manually, to make sure that something is like going in correctly, because there are times where you can do automation, there's times where you need to do manual testing and just finding out where your tests need to be. But if you're collecting the data, so for logins, you could just have depending on how you set out your jobs, like it could be reading it from environment variables, or it could just be reading it from a file and then kind of picking, like each test will know what data to pick up where possible. But trying to limit anything that kind of reads from a disk or writes to a disk is important to kind of getting you that speed that we were talking about at the beginning of the talk.
Awesome. Great. I think we're almost out of time. So thanks, David. Thanks for walking us through sort of how to scale and run tests in parallel, Selenium tests in parallel, and also showing us how to run those different combinations on different browsers and on mobile devices on the BrowserStack platform. I want to thank you all for attending. We will be sharing this recording with all of you and all of you who have registered via email. And I definitely want to encourage you guys and everyone to attend the next session of the Summer of Learning series, the last session actually, which will be next Friday on the 29th of May, where we will sort of talk about in more detail what David covered a little bit in his presentation, which was around fragmentation and thinking about how do I test in a mobile first market as more and more of the world accesses the web and accesses all of your web applications and properties through their mobile phone first, how do you think about that as a QA team, as a QA engineer? So yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're going to talk about some of this research that we've done as a company into the mobile first market and into fragmentation of the web. So looking forward to seeing you all next week on the 29th of May. Thank you all. Have a great day.